Hi guys, Buildzoid here from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, and today we're going to be taking a look at the ASRock Z390 Taichi Ultimate motherboard. So, yeah, let's get right into it, right? Starting with the different features scattered around the board, and then we're going to, of course, go over the VRMs.
Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their high-end thermal compounds. Thermal Grizzly makes cryonaut paste for high thermal performance and conductivity without being electrically conductive, so you don't have to worry about shorting components. Cryonaut is particularly good for replacing stock GPU pastes, as Cryonaut is a non-curing compound. Learn more at the link in the description below.
So then, features. Well, let's start off with probably the most useful troubleshooting feature. There's a postcode down here, so that's really nice to see. This basically displays it's a letter and a number code, and you can look up in the manual what those codes mean, and that'll give you some idea of what's wrong. So really useful for troubleshooting. Under that, we actually find two BIOS chips, so the board does have dual BIOS. Unfortunately, it's not manual dual BIOS. There is no BIOS switch button, there's no BIOS switch, there's nothing, really, to control which BIOS you're on. There are some LEDs to indicate which BIOS chip you're on, but as far as which BIOS chip gets used, you basically have a primary BIOS and a backup BIOS, and the board will put you on the backup BIOS if there's enough boot issues. So basically, it's a software dual BIOS implementation. I am not a fan of these. Gigabyte has this kind of dual BIOS implementation on basically every single motherboard they've made in the last couple years, and it's just not very reliable. It'll sometimes switch which BIOS chip you're on at kind of random, like for no good reason. I'm not sure if this is true of the ASRock one, but generally I prefer manual control over which BIOS chip I'm on. The reason that ASRock does it the software way, and I assume why Gigabyte does it the software way as well, is idiot proofing, because say, like, there are motherboards that do allow you to manually control which of the two BIOS chips you're on, and people have a tendency to brick both BIOS chips on those. So ASRock is basically saying, look, we're not going to let you choose which BIOS chip you're on because you're going to brick the board. So I get why they're doing it. I'd still prefer if, there was some manual override for that functionality. Or they could have added like a third backup BIOS chip, for the especially incompetent users who manage to brick both BIOS chips on a dual BIOS board. Like, I still don't get how you do that. Like, if you brick one chip, the first thing you should do is just like recover the bricked chip. And then you could start messing around with the BIOSes again. You shouldn't like brick one and then go and do the same thing that bricked the first one to the second one. Like, I don't know, but anyway, ASRock has it software-wise because they don't trust people to not do that, which I guess is fair. Next to that, we have a clear Cmos jumper. There is also a clear Cmos button located up here in the I/O section, and it's really far away from, really everything else, so you shouldn't really hit that. Because I have heard that apparently some people press that when, reaching behind for USB ports or something, and it's just like, well, this is right above the Wi-Fi antenna, so it's not really in the middle of any of the USB ports, so I'd just be more careful, I guess. I mean, you shouldn't really run the risk of hitting that one. And back down here again, we have the reset button and the power button. There's no sort of advanced overclocking buttons like, say, safe boot, retry, reserved switch off of, like a cold bug removal switch that, say, Asus boards sometimes have. All of the sort of extreme overclocking boards from Asus they have a cold bug removal switch, but you don't have that here. Though the board does actually have all of the necessary voltage controls to do that, which is kind of interesting. Like, ASRock is basically going like, okay, this board has to do everything, and I'm a fan of that. Like, I'm really glad that they're just like, yeah, we've implemented voltage controls for absolutely everything. And I went through the BIOS manual and the motherboard manual, and it was just like they've literally just every random voltage. Like, these are voltages that you'd never need to adjust even on like LN2, and it's just like, yeah, you can tweak those too. So that's pretty neat. Anyway, so that covers sort of the buttons and troubleshooting features the board has. I'm kind of sad it doesn't have safe boot. I think all motherboards should really have safe boot. Safe boot is great. Safe boot is like the best button Asus ever came up with. So, and I think more motherboards should really have it. Like ASRock has it on some of their boards, but here they don't. So that's kind of unfortunate. Up here, worth noting is this chip right here, which is the Aquantia 10 gig LAN. And this thing is freaking expensive. Like, this chip is like almost $50. So this is a significant chunk of the board's price tag, which really, really surprised me, like how expensive this thing is. So yeah, that's worth noting. And then, of course, for power connectors, we have a 4-pin and an 8-pin. We do not have any extra power for the PCIe slots, which makes sense. Like, some of the other boards opt to have like a 6-pin or a Molex for extra PCIe slot power, but really on LGA 1151, you don't have enough PCIe lanes to occupy all the PCIe slots. I mean, AMD GPUs won't actually stop you from doing that. Like, you can run 3-way crossfire on this. Like, I've done it. You can run the 3-way crossfire off of this kind of PCIe slot situation, but this one's running off of the chipset. This one's 8x off the CPU. This one's 8x off the CPU. It's just like, it tends to bottleneck the GPUs when you do that. So it's not really a practical use, and so it makes sense that there's no extra power connector, because 2 GPUs really shouldn't be able to overload the 24-pin, and you won't be using more than 2 GPUs anyway. So that's that. And for the CPU power, you have the 8-pin and the 4-pin, and I've seen a lot of people on the internet freaking out about the extra 4-pin because they don't have PSUs that can with the extra 4-pin power connector. And you really don't need to worry about that. Your 9900K, unless you're delidding and like abusing your 9900K in various ways, there is no way you're going to be able to cool more power than what this power connector is able to deliver. So you don't need to worry about that. Just plug in the 8-pin and you'll be fine. The 4-pin is there if for LN2 or various sub-zero cooling methods, people who sand down their dies, delidded with liquid metal. And I still don't think even like delidded with liquid metal, you would be able to max out the 8-pin. Really, that 8-pin starts being an issue once you start looking at like 10 core and a higher core count CPUs. Or, well, no, X99 was fine off of a single 8-pin, at least up until the 6950X came out, because the 6950X does like 400 watts plus pretty easily in terms of CPU power consumption. So yeah, but on the 9900K, you don't need to worry about that being plugged in. And if you don't even have a 9900K, you have to worry about that even less, right? Like if you have the 9700K. Now then, let's move on to the VRM. And it's pretty normal. It's not super massive. In fact, I think this VRM is kind of lacking as far as I'm concerned. I'm not sure how the cooling situation is. You can kind of get a glimpse of the heat sinks here, and they are rather substantial heat sinks. Like, I'll give ASRock that. These heat sinks do look like they have some they have more surface area than a lot of the past heat sinks they've put out on boards. But the VRM is unfortunately not, it's not even as good as what you'd get on some of the X470, like say the X370 motherboard, the X370 Taichi had a better VCore VRM from, if my memory is serving, if I'm remembering it correctly. And I think the X470 Taichi is also better on the VRM department, which is kind of odd considering the 9900K pulls significantly more current than a 2700X will ever do, than a 2700X will. So that's worth keeping in mind. Anyway, the phase layout is basically VCore, vGPU, so that's what powers your iGPU, and quite frankly, this, for a lot of people, this will not go completely unused, which is kind of unfortunate, but, well, because that could be 2 extra phases for VCore power, which would be a lot more useful as far as I'm concerned, but apparently some people like to use the quick sync feature of Intel integrated GPUs, but since I've never messed with that, I don't know how useful that is, but, yeah, so you do get a iGPU power up there. And then here we get VCCSA, so system agent power, and VCCIO. So while this all looks like one block of phases, like one big VRM, it's actually 4 different ones. And VCCSA, VCCIO are both 1 phase each. VCore is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 phase, and that is actually like 10 phase with doublers. So you have this chip right over here, which is the IR35201. The doublers are on the back of the board, which is why you can't see them in this picture. You have the IR35201 for the VRM control, and that is running in 5+2 phase mode, which is fine. This chip goes up to 8 phases, so honestly, if ASRock kind of changed the layout of the board and added like 2 more phases right where VCCSA and VCCIO are, they could have gone up to 6+2. Like, that would have been totally viable. But they're running it in 5+2 phase mode, and that 5 then goes into an IR3598, which is a dual driver as well as a doubler built in together. And this actually goes, well, both of those lines go into a IR3598 as well, but that one is running in dual driver mode. So that then goes to 2 phases, and this then goes to 10. The IR35201, you know, it's a high-end digital voltage controller from International Rectifier, pretty standard for all recent high-end motherboards. Actually, I don't think there's been a single high-end motherboard that used something other than a 35201 for VCore. Actually, no, there's the ISL 69138. That's the only competitor for this chip, the ISL 69138. And the 35201 goes up to a switching frequency of 2 megahertz, which is more than enough to completely max out the Mosfets, even if you have doublers. So you wouldn't actually run it all the way at that switching frequency. Now, the Mosfets themselves here are Texas Instruments CSD 87350s. And these are dual NFETs, so that's why we only have 1 chip, not 2. The high side and the low side are integrated into these. Each of these is, well, Texas Instruments rates these, they're from TI. So Texas Instruments rates these as a 40 amp power block. That is not like a actual useful output, because if you have 10 of them like this and you actually tried to push 40 amps through all of them at the same time, you'd be looking at a heat output of around 88 watts. So let's talk VRM heat output figures, right? Like, how much heat will the VRM produce for any given amount of current that you're going to push through it? So 150 amps, this is around where an 8700K or a 9700K will max out. Somebody might be wondering, wait a minute, the 9700K has 8 cores and no hyperthreading, and the 8700K has 6 cores and does have hyperthreading. How do they pull the same current? Well, it turns out the hyperthreading increases your power consumption roughly by the same amount that it increases your performance, and both of those are about 30 to 40% depending on the scenario. So the 9700K with roughly 30% more core, with 33% more cores, ends up pulling about as much power as an 8700K maxed out. That's where those would fall, and also the 8086K would also fall in this category. So 150 amps for those, and at that current output, which this would be a 500 kilohertz switching frequency, 5 volts gate to sort, 5 volts drive voltage for the Mosfets, which is their rated voltage, like that's what they're meant to run on. There's no improvement in efficiency from running them on more. So running them like that with 1.3 volts out, you're going to be looking at roughly 19 watts of heat output at 150 amps, which I am not a fan of. That is honestly... that's, like, it doesn't sound like a lot, but with motherboards, what tends to happen is the heat sinks don't tend to be able to dissipate that much heat. Though admittedly, the heatsink on this board, like, does really, like, it does overhang the VRM, like, all the way down here, so I'm not sure how the cooling system will deal with it, but that is a concerning number as far as I'm concerned. Like, a lot of boards where you're looking at around 20 watts, they very easily go well over 100 degrees Celsius on the VRM once you start looking at that kind of heat output. And it's going to get worse if you have a 90, so, you know, that would be the, and it's going to get worse if you have a 9900K completely maxed out, because then you're going to be looking at about 200 amps output. And at that point, this VRM is going to produce about 27 watts of heat. Which, like, again, if ASRock did a good job with the heatsink, that's really not that hard to deal with. I'm not sure about what the heatsink's like, but this is definitely not the most efficient VRM out there on Z390. It's also not the worst. There's definitely a lot worse. If you go, you know, with a lot cheaper boards, yeah, you can definitely find VRMs where I wouldn't even put the 9900K near them. But the thing is, at like this price tag, I think they should be aiming more around 20 watts rather than 27. Which isn't a huge difference, but like a lot of the other boards are getting, you know, that 20 watt figure, and some of the ultra high end boards are getting even less than that. So this is just like, I'm not particularly impressed by that, but hey, if ASRock's done a good job with the heatsink, they can easily, like, they can deal with that. It's just, at that point, it's really down to the heatsink, because the VRM itself is not the most efficient thing ever on Z390. Now, going up to 250 amps output, at this point we're going, you know, so this would be like practical water-cooled, air-cooled water overclocking, and really that 200 amps output, you'd be looking at like delidded with liquid metal, maybe a sanded down die. This is really maxing out a 9900K. You're looking at almost, like, that's the kind of current you would see at around, say, 1.4-ish volts, right? So going past that, we're talking about like extreme overclocking scenarios. So 250 amps, we're going to be looking at about 39 watts of heat. And that's hot. That's honestly really hot. And the only good thing is that, you know, since this is probably what you're going to hit with extreme overclocking, at that point, the motherboard is going to be probably freezing over at idle, and you're not going to be running it for extended periods of use. So the VRM won't have enough time to actually overheat. So it'll be like, it'll still be fine, but it won't be like, it won't be one of, like, I'd keep the heat sinks on this board if I was running it sub-zero. And I've actually done that for a lot of motherboards where I'd keep the heat sinks on them. But some motherboards, you run them sub-zero and the heat sinks end up freezing over, and then you have a massive puddle. And this one, I'd be like, well, the heat sinks are probably going to defrost and actually go above ambient eventually. You know, going further, 300 amps, and this, at this point, I don't think you can actually hit that, but let's say you did, the VRM would be producing 52 watts of heat if Intel, let's say Intel went insane and decided to put a 12 core on the LGA 1151 socket. So 10 nanometer doesn't work out, just keep adding cores to the mainstream socket. Anyway, but 300 amps, 52 watts, yeah, that is just not going to work. This isn't big enough. The heatsink, there's no way the heatsink can deal with that at that point. 350 amps, because we've still not maxed out that current rating, right? Because this is a 10 phase, so there are 10 of these. You'd think you'd be able to pass 400 amps. So 350 amps, you'd be looking at about 70 watts of heat, which is just like, at this point, we're like, past that 52 watts figure, we're past practical. Like, anything in this range at this point, like, you're not going to be able to cool this. 400 amps, which is where the VRM like, that's the absolute maximum rating for the actual dual NFETs. At that point, you're looking at 88 watts of heat. Completely impractical. So while it is like, it's completely like, these are 40 amp rated dual NFETs, right? It's just not like a practical rating when you have 10 of them next to each other. If you had one of these chips, right, and a massive heatsink dedicated just to cooling one of these chips, then yes, you could pass 40 amps through it. And it wouldn't like burn out or anything. But in an actual real world scenario where you have 10 of them next to each other, that doesn't work. That 40 amp current rating, really, practically speaking, you're probably looking at more like 20. You know, 20 amps, maybe 25. Really, like, the heatsink could maybe still deal with that. Well, if you threw enough airflow at it, it'll deal with that. That's one of those things. If you cram enough air through a heatsink, you'll eventually be able to cool pretty much anything, at least up until the point where the metal itself making up the heatsink is the bottleneck. Yeah, so you know, for a 9900K, like for a 9700K, I'd say this is perfectly like a good fit. I wouldn't be worried. I think the heatsink should be just fine for that. 9900K might be pushing it. Then again, if you're not like doing things to the 9900K to fix the cooling situation, you're probably not going to be able to hit that 200 amp figure anyway. You know, if you're at like 5 gigahertz with like 1.3 volts, you're not going to be hitting that. You'd be like, well, you'd be looking at a few amps below that, but that would already significantly drop your heat output. I mean, there's only a 50 amp difference between these two. So if you were pushing like 180 80 amps, you know, you'd be looking at more like 24 watts. And that's, I mean, that doesn't sound like a huge difference, but small differences, you know, add up. So the heatsink will obviously have an easier time dealing with less heat output there. So really, like, this VRM, I mean, it's a 10-phase. It's not using particularly terrible components in any way or form, but is just not really big enough. I was honestly, for Z390, I was expecting ASRock to use a freaking, like, use a 12-phase, right? Like, they've run a 12-phase of this MOSFET with this controller, with these doublers on other motherboards. In fact, like, their X470 Taichi, I'm pretty sure, uses this VRM with just 2 more phases. And that would have significantly, like, that would have, you know, given you an extra, like, that would have significantly helped the efficiency if they just added 2 more phases. But I guess I guess they decided that they're not going to bother with the phases, and they beefed up the heatsink, because the heatsink does look a lot better than on like previous Taichi motherboards. But I'm not sure how that works out in practice. But the VRM itself, it really just comes down to cooling, because it's not that efficient, especially not compared to like some of the other Z390 motherboards. Because I'm already aware that there are boards that can do that 200 amps output with that 19 watt heat output figure from the 150 amps output for this one. So yeah, that is, you know, I'm just not impressed, especially considering that in with a lot of other motherboards, ASRock's just blown the competition away on the VRM quality. And then here it's just like, well, it's not bad, but it's not exactly like it's pretty borderline between, you know, being like bad and good. Like it's average there. This is what I'd consider average. That's the term I'm looking for. Like, it's in between sort of the good ones and the bad ones, because the components themselves are pretty good. There's just not really enough phases as far as I'm concerned. VGPU, fine. Like, nobody's going to push 80 amps through that anyway, so I wouldn't worry about it. Actually, most people probably won't have that VRM running. If you have a dedicated GPU plugged in, then this VRM will start, like, unless you tell the motherboard to keep the iGPU running, it'll turn off. So you don't have to even worry about that one. It probably won't be running. VCCSA and VCCIO are both minor rails, so they don't really push a lot of current, so you don't really need to worry about them. But they're made up of FDPC 5030 MOSFETs from Fairchild Semiconductor, and they're controlled by these chips down here. So, and this one's System Agent, this one's IO, and those are ANPEC APW 8722s, and those are just single phase buck converters. So no, you know, nothing too impressive right here. We regularly see these kinds of, like, this. Actually, I think exactly this chip might be on a couple of GPUs for memory power. So it's pretty popular for like single phase applications. Nothing special right there. It really doesn't need to be. VCCSA and VCCIO never go over, you know, even like 10 amps output. That's pretty much where they top out. And VCCIO is even lower than SA. So you don't need to worry about those. We have a couple of linear regulators around here. And those are handling all of the extra extreme overclocking voltages, like your, one that, like, ASRock has a voltage that they call the cold bug killer, which I'm pretty sure is their renaming of the VCC PLL_OC voltage. So that would be on one of these regulators. Then there's a couple of other PLL voltages for the CPU, DMI voltage. that would also be on these. So there's a whole bunch of voltages that would be just hanging off of these little regulators down here. Then we have some miniature buck converters sitting right around this Hyper BCLK rebranded clock gen over here. So the clock gens on the Z390 motherboards, they're added so that you have either more basically they're added to add more range to the BCLK overclocking, so you can crank up the BCLK to like ridiculous levels. Some boards will go up to all the way up to like 400 megahertz or higher even, and at that point it's really not practical. But if you're doing like max memory frequency or max CPU frequency, the other use is that they add extra granularity, and so you can increase your core clock or your memory clock by very, very small increments by using the BCLK. So that's why a lot of Z390 boards will have clock gens. And it's, so this is ASRock's, and we have some more voltage regulators around that. We don't need the details on those. Those are so low power, you don't need to worry about them. Then we have VPP down here. Again, this is one of those minor rails where it's like, it exists, you don't need to worry about it, it's not going to blow up. That's for the DDR4 memory chips. That's for your DDR4 memory. And then up here, in typical ASRock fashion, we have a completely ridiculous memory VRM. So this chip right here is a UP1674. I can't get a datasheet for that, but that is a two-phase voltage controller from UPI Semiconductor. And this right here is the two phases that it's controlling for VDDR, which is completely ridiculous. ASRock is like... And I think, well, Asus also does two-phase memory power, but ASRock goes and uses like full-size dual NFETs for their memory power, which is just, I don't know why they do that. It's completely overkill. I assume it's to simplify the bill of materials, but the thing is, well, yeah, actually they might have a point with that. They could have used one phase instead of two, but again, they're on the FDPC 5030s from Fairchild Semiconductor. So that is typical ASRock fashion, massive overkill memory VRM. For the capacitors all around the motherboard, we're looking at Nichicon FP series 12 FP12Ks. ASRock has them painted black. That's basically just something that you can get if you request it. It's no big deal. But they are rated for 12,000 hours at 105 degrees. And they are used completely everywhere. And Nichicon is a Japanese manufacturer of capacitors. So, and I think, can we see it? Nope, this motherboard doesn't do that. Yeah, this one doesn't do it. Actually, no, they might be doing it. Because they have like, oh no, that's different rails. I'm seeing something that isn't there. So, yeah, that is the Taichi Ultimate. I mean... I'm not impressed. I'm not impressed by the 10 phase they've opted for. The heatsink does look like it should be able to handle it. Like, I think the heatsink, the heatsink plays a huge role here because they are like the VRM is not exactly what I would consider the most efficient of Z390 VCore VRMs, but the heatsink can make the heatsink can make it or break it, right? Because if you have a terrible VRM and you stick a big enough heatsink on, like. If your VRM was producing 100 watts of heat, right? Let's just theoretically say it was producing 100 watts of heat. Well, if you put a 100-watt heatsink on it, that's not a problem. It's not going to overheat. It's still really inefficient, but it's not going to overheat. So it really comes down to the cooling system from ASRock. And from what I've seen of the heatsinks, they look substantial. So I'm just hoping that Steve tests out the VRM thermals on this board. Because the VRM itself is one of those where this definitely needs a heatsink. There's some other Z390 motherboards where the VRM heatsink is just completely irrelevant because the power stages and just everything, like there's too many phases and the phases are too good and it's just like, yeah, whoever, like the heatsink is an unnecessary add-on for the VRM cooling on those. But here, this needs the heatsink. This definitely needs the heatsink and hopefully the heatsink is good. So, yeah. Well, other than that, I guess the highlight for most people with this motherboard is going to be that Aquantia 10 gig LAN chip, because I think this is probably one of the cheapest boards to come with it. So, yeah, that's kind of that. I mean, it's pretty average. I'm kind of sad that because in the past, ASRock has made boards where it was just like, well, nobody gets even close to what ASRock had. And more recently, everybody seems to be catching up, and ASRock, I feel like they might be slipping up, but then again, I've not looked at I never really paid much attention to the ASRock's Z370 lineup or the Z270 lineup. So yeah, that is it for the video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. And if you'd like to help out Gamers Nexus, then you can, pick up a mod mat, which you can see in the background of the image. From store.gamersnexus.net. And what else is there? We also have a Patreon page, so you can support us from there. And I have a channel called Actually Hardcore Overclocking, where I do more PCB breakdowns and other overclocking related stuff. So if you'd like to check see more of that kind of content, then that would be pretty cool if you checked out my channel. Anyway, that is it for the video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.